seeing everybody here is just like, wow, it's just wonderful. And I was on the train in, I was thinking about it, and basically in this lecture I'm sort of just putting forward different ideas about what astrology is, and I realised the very first night, in the very first lecture, the very first 5 minutes of the very first lecture in the whole MA, right, the question was raised by that gentleman over there, Professor Michael York, what is astrology? And we all thought we knew the answer. That was our naivety back then. And I realised we're still chewing on that answer. And what I want to share with you this morning is my current version of a possible answer, but it is a work in progress, and it will be a work in progress forever, really, for all of us. So, but I really like that synchronicity. So thank you for letting me start first to simply raise that question. And also I'll know when it really is a whole gathering of us, that when I start getting into a good argument with Bernard. I just remember those wonderful seminars where we just debated back and forth. I think Michael wondered what the hell had happened in his seminar room. Right. Okay, so this is work that I first put together in my master's dissertation. But obviously it's grown legs and keeps working and keeps developing. So it's probably, you wouldn't recognise it in the master's dissertation now, but it's the same sort of thing. And what I want to look at and what I want to challenge this morning is that we've done a lot of thinking about trying to unpack what astrology is. What I want to do is just reverse that and say, no. Let's unpack the world we're trying to fit it into. And let's challenge that. In other words, let's not try and redefine astrology, let's actually look at cosmology and look at chaosmos. Let's actually challenge the whole notion of cosmology, because that's the thing that's difficult for astrology to deal with, I believe. So, cosmology, probably the idea of Plato's cosmology gets really injected into popular culture with Carl Sagan and his whole approach of the beautiful, perfect cosmos, which we know is Platonistic. You know, Plato, a lovely quote from Plato, in that cosmology is, or he defines cosmos as the partnership and friendship, orderliness, self-control and justice which hold together heaven, earth and the gods and man. A very powerful quote for cosmology, because it's got moral qualities in it as well. But it's all about justice and right, and things will be, if you are good, things will be good. It's that type of model. And then he says, and that's why we call it a cosmology, and it's a world in order, and it is, my friend, not an undisciplined world disorder. What Plato does is that he takes the idea of cosmos, this is in the Timaeus obviously, which most of you would be quite familiar with, and he turns the world into number, in a sense. We get his perfect shapes, obviously, but Edward Casey, gives a nice quote about Plato's universe. He says he takes the special power of mathematics to shape a cosmos which proceeds from the sky downwards. So Plato makes the numbers in the sky, the perfect forms, and then it comes down onto Earth, which is a nice concept for astrology. And in Plato's cosmology, which obviously is, well, obviously is the wrong word clearly, but it is one that is adapted into the Western mindset, particularly from the Enlightenment onwards. It's very much a geometrical world soul, and it's driven by divine intellect. So we have number and we have divine reason is the driving force, the creator of it all. If we step back from that just for a second, because it's easy to fall in love with Plato, it's easy to say, yes, I feel at home. Do you know, it's easy to be comforted by his poetic language and feel good about it. But we must not be, enter our anti-Plato man, welcome Patrick, we must not be seduced by that. If we step back, what are we actually buying into when we buy into Plato's view of cosmology? And we're buying into a world that is not made, everything is not equal in it. Not at all. It's not a world of equals at all. there is an interconnectedness, but it's hierarchical, and God and reason, God first and then reason, are privileged over everything else. So that's the top, and everything else is down in a scale. So his cosmology is hierarchical, it's orderly, it's logical, it's designed using numbers by an artisan God, and it's maintained by a divine mind. So the way you fit into that, and you do fit into that, but as some impure smudge, right, in the perfect system, in this model. But you're definitely way down the list of the pecking order, because it's quite hierarchical. And of course this is supported by Plotinus, he's the great beginning of Neo-Platonism. Of course he didn't know it as Neo-Platonism then, he was just doing his thing. But he takes Plato's thinking even further. He creates, in a sense of a divine one, and he actually calls the cosmos in an intellectual cosmos, or cosmos of intellect. And that becomes a deriving principle in the cosmology that then runs into the Western mindset. And I know I'm generalising a little bit there, but just I've only got 20 minutes, so I'm going to generalise in a few spots. We get a few hiccups along the way. And one of the major hiccups, which I think is quite interesting, and this is a scholar many of you would know, is Marcel Eliade. And in 1957, and I write the date there because that's 1957. You know, we're still in the modern world then. The 60s hadn't happened, for those of you old enough to remember the 60s. So this is really early, and he challenges this view. And he's then talking about the way the world is made in this Greek cosmology. And he says the universe does not properly, for the modern people, for the moderns, the universe does not properly constitute a cosmos. That is a living and articulated unity. It is simply the sum of the material resources and physical energies of the planet. And he then goes on to, and the worry now with this cosmology is how soon we're going to run out of those resources, full stop. And what's important about Eliade's quote there, back in 1957, is he's putting forward the idea of a living unity, that a cosmology should be a living unity, that there should be, it's more than just the numbers, the rocks, the weights, the large-scale astronomy. And he puts that into the system. And of course we know that that gets picked up and expanded upon. I mean, we're all here today because that gets picked up and expanded upon. We're all doing the study of cosmologies in different ways, and we're defining cosmology quite differently. So today, we've redefined it in very much an Eliade manner, in terms of it includes the living world. And we've got scholars like Nick, we've got scholars all over the place that will actually are redefining the cosmology as containing the living world. And it must, in that regard, it becomes then, once we get into postmodernism and beyond, we get this incredible pluralism coming in, where whatever is your belief is your cosmology. So it's quite inclusive in that regard. And we all feel fairly comfortable about that. But I have a problem with it. And indeed, it's a problem I sit with because I have a problem with some of the themes in the MA, which is great because it's good to argue these things. And the problem is the privileging of cosmos. If we use cosmos for everything, in my worldview, it's like using the masculine pronoun for every single person. It denies the existence of other ontologies. And although we're going to accept that you've got belief systems and that's your personal cosmology, because we're labelling it cosmology, there's an inherent sense of order, of rationale in there. You know, it's like an undercurrent that's there, imposing itself on the view that we have. So if everybody or everything is a cosmology, then we become blind to other possible ontological forces. So let me give you another ontology. This actually has just as good credentials as Plato's cosmology, in the Greek cosmology. Has very big names that stand up beside it. You can put Heraclitus for a start in that one. You can put the whole of Stoicism into it, so list the Stoics, you've got them all. And what we get is an idea of Stoic sympathia and the notion of chaosmos, which doesn't get named chaosmos until James Joyce, obviously considerably later than the Stoics, right? So let's just look at this and see what they're doing. Sympathia, classical cosmology, and I'm using the word classical next to the cosmology to, in a sense, to not say modern cosmology, contain the notion of sympathia. This is a sympathetic cosmos. It's defined by Sophie Botros, who's a wonderful Stoic scholar, as where nature, life, gods or divine, and the organic and inorganic world all combine in one sympathetic, connected relationship. Now the key things there is it's the organic and inorganic. So the rock, the desk, the technology is definitely the top of the hierarchy in the room. Right? If it goes wrong, everything goes wrong. But everything is included in this model, in this sympathia. So there is no hierarchy, it is just this intense interconnected relationships. Another Stoic scholar, Susan Bobzien, defines it as, in some sense, everything in the universe emits some physical influence on everything else. But it is influence at a distance. It's not sort of, if I drop this, the thing falls, and we can understand a sense of cause and effect. It's actually the fact that birds might fly across and form the pattern of the TSD logo as I'm lecturing above my head. Do you know that? It's that type of interaction. It's things where we cannot see a cause of. So the engine room in this Stoic sympathia, the agent that bound us all together, and the rocks and the trees and everything, was the sense of the divine breath, the air, the breath. So it combined everything, rocks, trees, human life, cosmos, the whole universe and everything within it was connected by this divine breath. Just as a little aside, that there was an issue about beans, eating beans, which the Pythagoreans didn't want to do. They were also into divine breath, because beans give you flatulence, and flatulence is not divine breath. Right? So just a little one of those things, right? So, and also it was considered that the air in Athens was better because they were brighter there. Did you know they must have had better air? In other words, the divine breath was stronger or richer there. And just, you know, if you hold that in your mind, if we step into sacred geography, there are some places which we instinctively feel have more of that divine breath than others. So just, there's all sorts of things you can do with this, which is very useful. Okay, now within this Greek idea of the ontology of the world, there were two components. There wasn't just cosmos, there was cosmos and chaos, or the void. And what actually happened was that cosmos, which was beautiful order, was born out of the void. And the void was cosmos's non-gendered parent. It's quite important, it's a non-gendered parent. In the Egyptian mythology, it's Khnum, and Khnum is the father of all fathers and the mother of all mothers. So that's the only way the Egyptians can actually get into a non-gender. They just sort of give it both genders. So it's a non-gendered parent. And depending on your creation mythology, cosmos either emerges like Venus from the shell, right? From out of the void. Hi, Beatrice. Or it's a battle or a fight, like as in Marduk, etc., in Genesis and so on. So some creation myths are blood-drenched. That's an Eliade term. They have to fight to get free, and they have to murder and mayhem. Whereas others are more sense of natural, emerging out of the clay or the earth or the water and becoming part human, part plant, and so on. Okay, so, but most importantly, these are these two components. But when you actually have a conflict creation mythology, where the cosmos or the order has to fight to establish itself, we actually get, and the book of Genesis and our creation mythology is a conflict mythology. The Big Bang is a conflict creation myth. That's a bit of conflict, you know. When you get that, chaos becomes defined as disorder, which is actually totally wrong. Disorder means order that's actually been lost. Chaos never had it to start with. It's not disorder, it's non-order. It's not irrational, it's non-rational. Do you know that? So chaos becomes disorder, and as a result it becomes the idea of disorder becomes a dominant definition of chaos from the classical world right through to the 20th century. That chaos becomes the negative, the disorder, the thing that mustn't happen. Now, oops, going backwards the wrong way. We get James Joyce coming onto the scene, and he's the first of quite a few writers, musicians, etc., that start to actively engage with the ontology of the void or chaosmos. He coins the word chaosmos, and he uses that in Finnegan's Wake. And he writes Finnegan's Wake chaotically with one of his characters. And so she's all over the place. But by allowing almost anything to happen, the character to be blown around in the wind, so to speak, and it can be quite confusing to read, what actually happens, the general consensus of the critique of the piece, is that it suddenly becomes deeper and richer and throbs with some sort of life that is almost hard to reach. And you don't know what you've read, but you know you've read something. Something's going on. And another author that picks up on chaosmos in his work is, of course, Umberto Eco, in The Name of the Rose. And the library in that book is a chaotic library. It's constant moving and shifting. So there are expressions of chaosmos coming into 20th century fiction, which is usually the place where new ideas start to emerge first. Fiction, poetry, art, etc. So if we put all of this together, what we actually get is that chaosmos can be defined as a multiple without definition or distinction, cyclic but not the return of the same, indifferent to scale or form, a metastable, that is a type of stability which has a potential buried within the ontological forces of its void. Now I know there's a lot there, but all of that comes from the way that different musicians and artists have used it and talked about it. So the potential of the void then to create is actually caused through or created by, that is absolutely impregnated with connectivity. Everything is connected to everything and sensitive to it. And from that, then order or new things emerge. Now, when we actually talk about if someone was living in such a world, what would it be like? And this is, I'm quoting myself here, sorry, right? If you live in such a world, then you live a life which is full of these collisions. These collisions produce a kaleidoscope of cyclic potentials, ideas, coincidences and events which can fracture across a plethora of reflective surfaces as signs, omens and coincidences, all of which deepen and enrichen the meaning and experience of your life. Right? These are all the 100 little synchronicities and odd things. And this is what it would be like if we lived in one of these. Now, I personally think we do live in one of these. Now, very quickly, because I'm getting short on time, very quickly, astrology, putting this now into an astrology is, it has a long history, we know, I'm not going to go into that, but by the time we get to the Hellenistic period, we get Ptolemy. What Ptolemy and Vitus Valens do is they organise it. They put the Greek cosmos into it, bang, and they give us number. they make it rational, and they remove it from the organic and they fill it with number. And you're all familiar with the type of numbers that we actually get. And that's just a tip of the iceberg. However, Ptolemy was doing it with a nodding to sympathia. There's no question about that. And I'm sure you're all aware of the quote where he simply says everything is connected, which is what we've got down here. And in the tetrabiblos. So he's injecting number into astrology, but he's very aware that this number is also somehow trying to capture the complex relationships of sympathia. So astrology, over its history, as we know, has had many, many different techniques, many different practices, many different focuses, and many different attitudes to the divine. What is interesting about astrology is that it is unable, it's utterly unable to relinquish its requirement of sympathia. It requires action at a distance. It requires Venus doing this and that happening down here. It's an essential ingredient to the essence of astrology. And it does that, it enables you to try and read that cause at a distance through numbers, through planetary cycles, through aspects, through houses, through speed of planets, motion, time, degrees, number. But the number that it does, and indeed astrology is number driven, that numbers are not normal digits. They're embedded with planetary or zodiacal symbolism. And so in that regard, they're really not digits. They're the original idea of figures that Pythagoras put forward, the figure as a living thing. So the numbers in astrology are Pythagorean figures which are empowered with quality. However, all these numbers give the wrong impression to many practitioners of astrology and also to outsiders of astrology, because it looks like it's dressed in cosmological clothes. It looks like it belongs to a world of science and order because it's driven by numbers. So, to a certain extent, astrology is getting misjudged because of its numbers. Now, if we step back to look at those numbers and look at astrology, it seems to me that astrology has two cloaks. There's two gowns it wears. And they're wrapped. One is the idea of sympathia, which is absolutely essential for astrology, and the other one is the surety of numbers. You will have your Saturn return tomorrow. That's the that's the surety of number. So what we know about astrology is we know that it is culturally relative. We know that. We don't have to argue. We were arguing that in 2002. We don't have to argue it anymore. We know it's sensitive to the shifts of society and the needs of societies and the expectations of society, and it keeps morphing and changing. And indeed, I've worked out it changes every 20 or 30 years. It's a very interesting creature that keeps shifting and changing, which is great, and it's part of its robustness. But also, I put it to you that it contains philosophical absolutism. There is an absolute that has never changed, that's not sensitive to cultural relativism. It's got an absolute vein running in it. And this absoluteness is its cosmic numbers, which are the numbers or the figures of Pythagoras, the numbers which are containing not only value but quality attached to those numbers. So in that regard, I'm suggesting that astrology stands between the cosmology of the moderns, and I use that in a Bruno Latour framework, the moderns, the cosmology of the moderns, and the chaosmos of the non-moderns. and that astrology is much more comfortable in the non-modern chaosmos, but will actually have an entree or a nodding acquaintance with, or can reach out to, those in the cosmos as well, the surety of number. So, and I think this is my last slide. If we, getting back to that question put, like, what is astrology in 2002, if we acknowledge the cultural relativism, but focus on the absolute component of these cosmic numbers, if we focus on that, then we can say that astrology is an attempt to domesticate the chaosmos, a phenomena of the sympathia. Right? We've got this emerging, creating force, and it's trying to give us entree to understanding what is coming out of that, what is emerging from it. And it enables us individually, or humanity, to peer into the void. And I should have put a capital V on that, because it's the void, to see what pattern is next going to emerge. So its cultural relativism is the way that it connects to cosmos. There's an order, there's a rationale, we can debate it, we can discuss it, we can write papers on it, we can do all sorts of things, we can look at pop culture and its influence on astrology, etc. So it's extremely rational, and that belongs to cosmos. Rational logic responding to cultural shifts. While its ability to give meaning to a lived life comes from its engagement with chaosmos. And we can't get rid of chaosmos. And I'm suggesting that we should acknowledge it exists rather than calling everything cosmology. Astrology belongs in a chaosmos. And there's the ad. So, yeah. Done that. Okay.
Bernadette, thank you. We do have time for one question from Michael York.
Could you explain why the hierarchical understanding of the cosmos or cosmology is non-sympathetic and non-interconnected in the way that the chaosmos?
I can only, coming from my own perspective, that when something has more power than something else, there's an assumption of power, I should say. And yet, so to take it to an extreme end, you can get a human being thinking that they're more superior than the rock in a particular environment, for example, or a tree. You take a living thing. And as soon as you bring in that hierarchical, then there's a lack of acknowledgement of the other. Now, that doesn't mean it will diminish, the chaosmos will still work on that individual, a little bit like Herschel's life world, everything is there. But the belief of the beholder, the belief of the individual, if it's in cosmos, will tend towards an idea of superiority and power over, and an insulation from the environment or the rock or the world.
So it's not, how do you put it? The Platonic understanding is that there is a kind of inherent error that I suppose is where this whole concept of power and the lack of sympathetic connection comes. So could that not also be intrinsic?
I think sympathia is intrinsic within the Platonistic cosmology, but there is a, dare I say, a false belief.
It's the error of this.
It's the error, of the hierarchy, the power over, Yeah, I think, yeah.
Thank you, Bernadette.
Right. Okay.